Arthur Sullivan, an 82-year-old man living in the heart of Boston, had always been a man of resilience and principle. He had spent most of his life working as a librarian, finding solace in the silent companionship of books. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 2 decades ago, leaving him with their only child, Michael. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Now 28, Michael had been living with Arthur for years, refusing to work or study, instead leeching off his father's modest pension. Arthur had tried everything to encourage his son to become self-sufficient. He had offered to pay for courses, help him find a job, and even suggested Michael start his own business. But Michael dismissed every suggestion, spending his days playing video games and his nights out with friends, living off the money Arthur had worked so hard to save. One evening, as Arthur sat at the dinner table, his patience finally snapped. The weight of years of frustration pressed down on him, and he knew he had to take a stand. Michael, Arthur began, his voice trembling with both age and emotion. This can't go on. You're nearly 30. You need to start taking responsibility for your life. Michael, lounging on the couch with his eyes glued to his phone, barely looked up. Dad, relax. I'll figure something out eventually. Why are you always on my case? Arthur's grip tightened around his cane. You've been saying that for years, Michael. I'm not going to pay for your lifestyle anymore. From now on, you need to find a job or a way to support yourself. I can't keep doing this. Michael finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. You're not serious. I am. I've already canceled the automatic payments for your bills. You have 2 months to get yourself together. After that, I won't be able to help you anymore. The room fell silent. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder with each second. Michael stared at his father, disbelief turning to anger. You can't do that, Michael shouted, standing up. What am I supposed to do without money? How am I supposed to live? You're a grown man, Michael. You'll figure it out just like everyone else, Arthur replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. Michael's face twisted into a sneer. If you cut me off, I'll make sure you regret it. I can easily put you in a nursing home and take your pension for myself. Then we'll see how well you manage on your own. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. He had always known Michael was lazy, but this level of cruelty shocked him to his core. The man who stood before him wasn't the boy he had raised, the boy who used to climb trees and beg for bedtime stories. I didn't raise you to be like this, Arthur whispered, his voice heavy with sorrow. Well, maybe you should have done a better job. Michael shot back coldly before storming out of the room. Arthur sat back down, feeling the weight of his years pressing heavily on his shoulders. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, now felt like a prison. He had hoped that by taking a hard stance, Michael would wake up and realize the importance of self-reliance. Instead, Arthur had inadvertently driven a wedge between them, one that might never be repaired. For the next few days, the tension in the house was palpable. Michael barely spoke to Arthur, and when he did, his words were filled with bitterness. Arthur began to worry, not for himself, but for his son, who seemed to be spiraling further into anger and resentment. Then, one morning, Arthur awoke to find Michael waiting for him in the kitchen, his eyes dark with determination. I've made up my mind, Dad, Michael said, his voice eerily calm. You're going to a nursing home. I've already found a place, and they're expecting you tomorrow. You've become a burden, and I don't have time to take care of you. Arthur stared at his son, his heart breaking. Michael, you don't have to do this. We can still work things out. It's too late for that, Michael replied, his face emotionless. You brought this on yourself. Without another word, Michael turned and left the room, leaving Arthur sitting alone at the table, the weight of his son's betrayal settling like a stone in his chest. Arthur knew he had no choice. He didn't want to go to a nursing home, but Michael's words had made it clear that he was no longer welcome in his own house. The son he had once loved more than anything had become a stranger, and Arthur had no idea how to reach him. That night, Arthur sat in his bedroom, surrounded by the few belongings he had chosen to take with him. He had lived in this house for over 50 years, first with his parents, then with his wife and son. Now he was leaving it behind, not because he wanted to, but because his son had forced him out. As he packed, Arthur's hand brushed against an old photograph of Margaret, her warm smile frozen in time. He stared at it for a long moment, memories flooding back. "Margaret," he whispered, "what did we do wrong?" But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. Arthur placed the photograph in his suitcase and took a deep breath. Tomorrow he would leave everything behind. The house, the memories, and the son who had turned his back on him. As he turned off the light and lay down in bed, Arthur felt a deep sadness settle over him. But beneath it, there was also a flicker of resolve. He had spent his life providing for others, first for his parents, then for Margaret, and finally for Michael. Perhaps it was time to do something for himself, to live the rest of his days on his own terms. And so, as he drifted off to sleep, Arthur began to form a plan, one that would take him far from the life he had known, and into a future he had never dared to imagine. The following day, Arthur was driven to the nursing home by Michael, who barely spoke a word during the entire ride. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his cane, staring out of the window at the city passing by. Boston had been his home for over 8 decades, but now, as they drove through its familiar streets, it felt more alien to him than ever. The nursing home was a modest building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a well-manicured lawn and a few trees that provided shade from the late summer sun. Michael pulled up to the entrance, cut the engine, and turned to his father. "Here we are," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Arthur looked at the building, then at his son. "Michael, are you sure this is what you want?" Michael's jaw tightened. "You've left me no choice." With that, he got out of the car, opened the trunk, and pulled out Arthur's suitcase. Arthur slowly exited the car, his legs trembling slightly as he stood. Michael handed him the suitcase and a folder containing the necessary paperwork. "Everything's set up," Michael said curtly. "Just go inside and check in. They'll take care of the rest." Arthur nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had imagined this moment in many ways, but never had he thought it would be so cold, so final. "Goodbye, Michael," he said softly. Michael didn't respond. He turned back to the car and got in, leaving Arthur standing alone on the sidewalk. A moment later, the car roared to life and sped off, leaving Arthur behind in a cloud of dust. Arthur watched the car disappear down the road, then turned to face the nursing home. He took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on his cane, and walked through the doors. Inside, the nursing home was clean and quiet. The receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Sullivan, welcome. We've been expecting you," she said. "Let me help you with your things." Arthur allowed her to take the suitcase, but he held onto his cane as if it were a lifeline. He was shown to his room, a small, simple space with a single bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. It was nothing like the home he had left behind, but it was comfortable enough. "We have activities planned every day, and the dining hall serves meals 3 times a day," the receptionist explained as she set his suitcase on the bed. "If you need anything, just press the button by your bed, and someone will come to help you." "Thank you," Arthur replied quietly, his mind already drifting elsewhere. Once he was alone, Arthur sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the lawn below. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the grass. It was peaceful, but Arthur felt no peace. Instead, he felt a deep, aching emptiness. For days, Arthur went through the motions of life in the nursing home. He attended meals in the dining hall, joined a few of the group activities, and took short walks around the grounds. But his heart wasn't in it. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been abandoned, not just by Michael, but by life itself. Then, one evening, as Arthur was unpacking his suitcase, he found a letter at the bottom of the bag. It was an old, yellowed envelope, addressed to him in Margaret's handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it, and as he unfolded the letter, he felt her presence with him once again. "My dearest Arthur," the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I know how hard that must be, but I want you to remember all the wonderful times we shared, and how much I love you. Arthur's eyes welled up with tears as he read on. Margaret's words were filled with love and warmth, just as she had been in life. She spoke of the years they had spent together, the joy they had found in each other, and the pride she felt in the life they had built. But then, towards the end of the letter, there was something unexpected. I know that you've always been careful with our money, and I'm grateful for that. But there's something you should know. Before I passed, I made some investments. At the time, I wasn't sure if they would amount to much, but I wanted to make sure you were taken care of after I was gone. I'm happy to tell you that those investments have grown beyond my wildest dreams. Arthur's heart skipped a beat as he read the final lines of the letter. I've arranged for you to have access to this money when the time is right. You'll find everything you need in the safe deposit box at the bank. Use it well, my love. I trust you to make the most of the time you have left. Arthur sat back in the chair, stunned. Margaret had never mentioned anything about a large sum of money, and yet here it was, revealed in this letter she had left for him. He didn't know how much the investments were worth, but from the way she wrote about it, it was clear that it was a significant amount. For the first time in weeks, Arthur felt a spark of something other than sorrow or regret. He felt curiosity, a sense of possibility that had been absent from his life for far too long. What if this money could change everything? What if it could give him the freedom to live the way he wanted on his own terms? The next morning, Arthur made his way to the bank, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. The safe deposit box was exactly where Margaret had said it would be, and when he opened it, he found several documents detailing the investments she had made. The total value of the assets left Arthur speechless. It was a fortune, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life and then some. As he stared at the documents, a plan began to form in Arthur's mind. He realized that this was his chance, not just to escape the nursing home, but to live out the dreams he had never thought possible. For too long, he had put his own needs aside, first for his parents, then for his wife, and finally for his son. But now, with this newfound wealth, he could finally focus on himself. Arthur returned to the nursing home that afternoon with a new resolve. He began making plans, researching places he had always wanted to visit, and thinking about how he could spend his remaining years in a way that brought him joy. He knew it wouldn't be easy. After all, he was still an old man with the limitations that came with age, but he was determined to make the most of the time he had left. He also knew that he needed to tell Michael the truth about the money. But as the days passed, and he saw no sign of his son, Arthur decided that Michael didn't deserve to know. Not after what he had done. Arthur had spent his life sacrificing for others, and now it was time to put himself first. With the arrangements in place, Arthur prepared to leave the nursing home. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, and he didn't leave a forwarding address. As far as the nursing home staff knew, he was simply an old man who had decided to move on. On the day of his departure, Arthur stood at the front entrance of the nursing home, his suitcase in hand. The receptionist who had welcomed him when he first arrived approached him with a smile. "Leaving us already, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked. "Yes," Arthur replied with a smile of his own. "It's time for a new adventure." With that, he walked out the door and into the world beyond, leaving behind the sadness and regrets that had haunted him for so long. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of freedom, of possibility. He had no idea where his journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was finally living life on his own terms. Arthur's journey began with a one-way ticket to Paris, a city Margaret had always dreamed of visiting but never got the chance to see. As he sat on the plane, looking out at the clouds, Arthur felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He was 82 years old, traveling alone to a foreign country, but instead of fear, there was a thrill in his heart, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The moment Arthur stepped out of Charles de Gaulle Airport and into the bustling streets of Paris, he felt a sense of liberation. The city was alive with energy. The sounds of laughter, conversation, and the distant strains of street musicians filled the air. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Arthur felt truly alive. He checked into a small boutique hotel in the heart of the city, a charming place with ivy-covered walls and a view of the Seine. The room was cozy, and as he unpacked his things, Arthur found himself smiling. This was exactly what he needed. A break from the routine, from the memories that had held him captive for so long. Over the next few weeks, Arthur immersed himself in the culture of Paris. He wandered through the Louvre, stood in awe beneath the grandeur of Notre Dame, and spent hours in the small cafes, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. He visited the places Margaret had talked about, carrying her memory with him as he explored the city. Every day was a new adventure, and with each passing moment, Arthur felt the weight of his past lifting. He no longer thought of the nursing home or of Michael, who had betrayed him so deeply. Instead, he focused on the present, on the beauty of the world around him, and on the simple joys of life. But while Arthur was rediscovering himself in Paris, Michael's life was beginning to unravel. Back in Boston, Michael was living in Arthur's old house, reveling in his newfound freedom. He had sold some of his father's belongings and was using the money to fund his lifestyle, parties, nights out with friends, and a life of indulgence. He didn't think twice about his father, who he assumed was safely tucked away in the nursing home, out of sight and out of mind. But that all changed one day when Michael received a call from the nursing home. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Susan from St. Mary's Nursing Home. I'm calling to inform you that your father is no longer in our care." Michael, who had been lounging on the couch with a drink in hand, sat up straight. "What do you mean he's no longer in your care? Did he?" His voice trailed off, panic rising in his chest. No, Susan quickly reassured him. "Your father left the nursing home of his own accord. He checked out a few weeks ago and didn't leave a forwarding address." Michael's mind raced. "Left? Where did he go?" "We're not sure. He didn't share his plans with us, and he made all the arrangements himself. But he seemed very determined," Susan explained. Michael hung up the phone, his heart pounding. This wasn't part of the plan. His father was supposed to stay in the nursing home, leaving Michael to enjoy the house and the pension in peace. But now Arthur was gone, and worse, Michael had no idea where he was. In a state of growing anxiety, Michael began to search through his father's things, desperate for any clue as to where Arthur might have gone. That's when he found the letter from Margaret that Arthur had left behind, perhaps intentionally, or maybe it had just fallen out during his hasty packing. Michael's hands shook as he read the letter, his eyes widening with every word. His father had a fortune, a hidden fortune that Michael had never known about. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. All this time, he had been scraping by, selling off his father's belongings, while the real treasure had been hidden away, just waiting to be discovered. But now that treasure was gone, along with Arthur. Desperation set in. Michael knew he had to find his father, not out of any sense of guilt or concern, but because he wanted that money. He needed it not just to maintain his lifestyle, but to fuel the greed that had consumed him. Without that money, he was nothing. Michael began his search, hiring private investigators and scouring through Arthur's bank records, trying to trace his movements. Took weeks, but eventually the trail led him to Paris. Arthur had withdrawn a significant sum of money from a bank in Boston and used it to book a flight to France. That was all Michael needed to know. Without a moment's hesitation, Michael booked a flight to Paris, driven by the singular goal of tracking down his father and reclaiming the fortune he believed was rightfully his. As the plane took off, Michael stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say, how he would manipulate Arthur into giving him control of the money. He landed in Paris with a plan in mind. He would find Arthur, play the role of the concerned son, and convince him to return to Boston. Once there, he would gain control of the finances, and Arthur would be out of the picture for good. But Michael underestimated his father. He had always seen Arthur as weak, easily manipulated, but what he didn't realize was that Arthur had changed. The man he was about to confront was no longer the passive father who had quietly suffered his son's disrespect. Michael began his search in the most obvious places, the hotels, the tourist spots, the banks. But Paris was a large city, and Arthur was surprisingly difficult to track down. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's frustration grew. He couldn't believe how elusive his father had become. Meanwhile, Arthur was thriving. He had left Paris behind after a few weeks, traveling through the French countryside, visiting vineyards, small villages, and historical sites. Every place he visited added to his sense of freedom and adventure. He was making the most of his time, savoring every moment, and never once looking back. One evening, as Arthur sat on the terrace of a small inn in Provence, enjoying a glass of wine, he overheard a conversation between two travelers. They were discussing a particular place in Switzerland, a remote, picturesque village in the Alps known for its tranquility and breathtaking views. The way they described it intrigued Arthur, and on a whim, he decided that it would be his next destination. The next morning, Arthur packed his bags and set off for Switzerland, leaving France behind. The journey through the Alps was stunning, with snow-capped mountains towering above and crystal-clear lakes reflecting the sky. When Arthur finally arrived in the village, he knew he had made the right choice. It was a place of peace and beauty, far removed from the worries of the world. Arthur rented a small chalet on the outskirts of the village, where he spent his days hiking through the mountains, exploring the local culture, and reflecting on his life. The village was everything he had hoped for: quiet, serene, and filled with the kind of natural beauty that soothed his soul. But even in this remote paradise, Arthur couldn't escape the past. One evening, as he sat on the balcony of his chalet, watching the sunset over the mountains, a familiar figure appeared at the bottom of the path leading to his door. It was Michael. Arthur's heart sank as he recognized his son. He had hoped to leave all the pain and conflict behind, but here it was, standing on his doorstep. He knew why Michael was there, and he knew that this encounter would be the hardest test of his resolve. Michael, on the other hand, was determined to get what he had come for. As he approached the chalet, he rehearsed the speech he had prepared, the words of concern and regret, the promises to change, all designed to win back his father's trust. But when he finally stood before Arthur, something in his father's eyes stopped him cold. The man who opened the door was not the frail, defeated old man Michael had expected. Arthur looked stronger, more at peace, and there was a calm determination in his gaze that unsettled Michael. "Michael," Arthur said quietly, "what are you doing here?" Michael hesitated, the words he had planned suddenly feeling hollow. "Dad, I was worried about you. You left without saying anything. I didn't know where you were, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Arthur studied his son for a long moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in, Michael. We need to talk." Michael entered the chalet, looking around at the simple but cozy furnishings. It was clear that Arthur had made a life for himself here, and for the first time Michael felt a twinge of uncertainty. He had always seen his father as someone who needed him, but now he wasn't so sure. They sat down in the small living room, the tension between them thick in the air. Arthur spoke first. "Michael, I know why you're here. You found out about the money." Michael's eyes widened, but he quickly tried to regain his composure. "Dad, I'm not here because of the money. I'm here because I care about you." Arthur shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "I wish I could believe that, but I know you, Michael. You've always been driven by what you can get from others, and this time is no different." Michael opened his mouth to protest, but Arthur held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish. I've spent my whole life trying to provide for you, trying to make sure you had everything you needed. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I was doing you a disservice. I was enabling you, letting you take without ever having to give anything in return." Michael's face hardened. "So this is your way of punishing me? By running off with the money and leaving me with nothing?" Arthur sighed, the weight of years of disappointment pressing down on him.
"No, Michael.
This isn't about punishing you. It's about me finally taking control of my own life. I've spent too many years living for others, and now it's time for me to live for myself." Michael stared at his father, anger boiling just beneath the surface. "So you're just going to abandon me?" Just like that, Arthur met his son's gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. I'm not abandoning you, Michael. You're an adult. It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. You don't understand. I need that money. Arthur shook his head. No, Michael. What you need is to figure out who you are without it. You've spent your whole life chasing after things, but those things have never made you happy. It's time you started looking for something deeper. Michael jumped to his feet, his face twisted with frustration. This isn't fair. You can't just leave me with nothing. I'm your son. Arthur remained seated, his voice calm but firm. And I love you, Michael. But love doesn't mean giving in to your every demand. It means doing what's best for you, even when it's hard. Michael stared at his father, his mind racing. He had come all this way, convinced that he could talk Arthur into giving him what he wanted. But now, faced with a father who had finally found his own strength, Michael felt powerless. I don't know what to do, Michael whispered, his anger suddenly giving way to fear. Arthur stood up and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You'll figure it out. You're stronger than you think. But you have to stop running from your responsibilities. Michael looked down, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had always relied on others to bail him out, to provide for him, to give him a sense of purpose. But now, for the first time, he realized that he was alone, truly alone, and it terrified him. Can you help me, Dad? Michael asked, his voice small, almost childlike. Arthur nodded slowly. I can help you, but not in the way you're asking. I can't give you money, Michael, but I can give you advice, and I can encourage you to find your own path. You have to take the first step on your own. Michael swallowed hard, the reality of his situation hitting him like a tidal wave. He had always believed that money would solve all his problems, but now he understood that his problems ran much deeper. I don't know where to start, Michael admitted, his voice trembling. Arthur gave his son a reassuring smile. Start by being honest with yourself. Admit your mistakes, take responsibility for your actions, and begin to rebuild your life from there. It won't be easy, but I believe you can do it. For a long moment, Michael said nothing. He had never seen this side of his father before. A man who was strong, independent, and unwilling to be manipulated. It was a side of Arthur that both scared and inspired him. Finally, Michael nodded. I'll try. Arthur squeezed his son's shoulder, feeling a glimmer of hope. That's all I ask, Michael. Just try. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the village, father and son sat together in the quiet of the chalet. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly, sharing their fears, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't solve all their problems, but it was a start, a small step toward healing the rift that had grown between them. And in that moment, as they sat together in the fading light, Arthur realized that he had found something far more valuable than money or possessions. He had found peace. Peace with his past, peace with his choices, and peace with the man his son was becoming. As days passed in the tranquil Swiss village, Arthur and Michael settled into an uneasy routine. They shared meals, took walks through the picturesque countryside, and really talked, for the first time in years. But despite the progress they were making, a tension lingered between them, a tension that Arthur knew stemmed from more than just the issue of money. Michael had always been a complicated person, charming but troubled, intelligent but lazy, loving but selfish. Arthur had spent years trying to understand his son, but he had never quite succeeded. And now, as they sat together in the cozy chalet, Arthur realized that understanding Michael fully would require more than just time. It would require honesty, and perhaps even pain. One afternoon, as they hiked up a trail that wound through the mountains, Arthur decided it was time to confront the lingering issues between them. Michael, Arthur began, his breath slightly labored from the climb. There's something I need to ask you, something I've been afraid to ask for a long time. Michael glanced at his father, a frown creasing his brow. What is it, Dad? Arthur paused, gathering his thoughts. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and fresh earth. Why did you never take responsibility? Not just with money, but with your life? What happened to make you so distant? Michael's steps slowed, and he stopped to look out over the valley below. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. Arthur waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that whatever Michael said next could change everything between them. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low and filled with a bitterness Arthur had never heard before. I always felt like I was never enough. Like no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough for you or Mom. Arthur's heart ached at the words. Michael, that's not true. We loved you, we still do. We just wanted what was best for you. Michael shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. But that's just it, Dad. You wanted what you thought was best, not what I wanted. You pushed me into things I didn't care about, and when I failed, it was like I was letting you down. So I just stopped trying. Arthur felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had always believed that he was doing the right thing, pushing Michael to succeed, to achieve more than he had. But now, hearing his son's words, he realized that his intentions, however well-meaning, had backfired. I'm sorry, Michael, Arthur said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't realize that's how you felt. I thought I was helping you. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, Dad, and maybe I should have said something sooner, but I didn't know how. It was easier to just give up, I guess. Arthur reached out and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. It's not too late to change things, Michael. You're still young, you can start over. Find something you're passionate about, something that makes you feel alive. Michael looked down at his father's hand, then back up at Arthur, his expression softening. I don't know if I even know how to do that anymore. You do, Arthur insisted, his voice firm. You just need to believe in yourself. And if you need help, I'm here for you. Just not in the way you might have expected. Michael managed a small smile, the first genuine smile Arthur had seen from him in a long time. Thanks, Dad. I appreciate that. They continued their hike in silence, the tension between them easing, but not entirely gone. There were still wounds that needed to heal, and Arthur knew that it would take time. But for the first time in years, he felt that they were on the right path. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the chalet, Arthur noticed Michael glancing at the documents detailing Margaret's investments. The papers had been left out on the table, and while Arthur had no intention of hiding them, he also hadn't wanted to flaunt them. Michael looked up, catching his father's gaze. Can I ask you something, Dad? Of course, Arthur replied, though he had a feeling he knew what was coming. Why didn't you tell me about the money sooner? Why keep it a secret? Arthur sighed, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't about keeping it a secret, Michael. It was about making sure that when the time came, I could use it for something meaningful, for myself, yes, but also for you. Michael frowned, clearly puzzled. What do you mean? Arthur took a deep breath, deciding it was time to reveal his true intentions. Michael, I've been thinking a lot about what to do with this money. It's more than I'll ever need, especially at my age. And I want to use it to help you, but only if you're willing to help yourself first. Michael's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? I mean, Arthur said carefully, that I want to set up a trust fund for you. It would provide you with a monthly allowance, but there would be conditions. You'd need to hold down a job, take care of your responsibilities, and start planning for your future. If you don't meet those conditions, the payments stop. Michael's expression darkened. So you're putting strings on it? You don't trust me to handle the money myself. It's not about trust, Michael, Arthur said gently. It's about making sure you have the support you need to build a life for yourself. I don't want to just hand you a fortune and watch you squander it. I want to give you the tools to create something lasting, something you can be proud of. Michael's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Arthur feared that his son would reject the idea out of pride. But then, slowly, Michael's shoulders sagged, and he nodded. Okay, Dad, I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. Arthur felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Thank you, Michael. I know this isn't easy, But I'm doing this because I believe in you. They spent the next few hours discussing the details, how the trust fund would be set up, what the conditions would be, and how Michael could start making changes in his life. By the time they finished, the fire had burned down to embers, and both men were exhausted but hopeful. As Arthur climbed into bed that night, he felt a sense of peace. He had taken a risk, trusting that Michael would rise to the occasion, but it was a risk worth taking. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he and his son were on the same page, working toward a common goal. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The next morning, as Arthur and Michael prepared to leave the chalet for another day of exploring, there was a knock on the door. Arthur opened it to find a man standing there, dressed in a dark suit and holding a briefcase. His expression was stern, almost cold. "Mr. Sullivan?" the man asked. "Yes," Arthur replied, puzzled. The man handed him a business card. "My name is John Harper. I'm an attorney representing a client who claims to have a legal interest in your late wife's investments." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "I don't understand. What client?" Harper's gaze shifted to Michael, who was standing behind Arthur, watching the exchange with growing concern. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid I must ask if you've been in contact with any other members of your late wife's family regarding her estate." Arthur frowned. "No, I haven't. What is this about?" Harper opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "It appears that your wife's investments were initially funded by a loan from her brother, George. He passed away several years ago, but his estate is now claiming that they are entitled to a portion of the returns from those investments." Arthur felt the room spin. Margaret had never mentioned anything about a loan from her brother. As far as he knew, she had made those investments on her own, with money she had saved over the years. "This must be a mistake," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "Margaret never told me about any loan." "I understand this is unexpected," Harper said, his tone softening slightly. "But the documentation is clear. Your wife's brother did provide the initial capital, and his estate now believes they have a claim to a significant portion of the returns." Arthur's mind raced. If this claim was legitimate, it could mean that the money he thought was his was no longer his to control. And worse, it could mean that Michael's future, everything they had just planned, was in jeopardy. "What do I need to do?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper handed him the documents. "You'll need to consult with your own attorney and review these papers thoroughly. If you choose to contest the claim, it could take months, even years, to resolve. But if the claim is upheld, a large portion of the funds could be forfeited." Arthur took the documents, feeling the weight of them in his hands. This was more than just a legal battle, it was a fight for everything he and Michael had just started to build. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice hollow. Harper nodded and turned to leave. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I'll be in touch with your attorney." As the door closed behind him, Arthur sank into a chair, his hands trembling. Michael stood across the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Dad," Michael said slowly, "what are we going to do?" Arthur looked up at his son, feeling a deep sense of despair. "I don't know, Michael. I don't know." The peace that Arthur had found in the mountains now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the cold reality of a legal battle that could strip them of everything. He had been so close to securing a future for himself and for Michael, but now that future was uncertain, hanging by a thread. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Arthur felt the weight of his age pressing down on him. He had thought that he had finally found a way to make things right, to give Michael the chance he deserved. But now, with the threat of losing it all, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to keep fighting. But as he looked into Michael's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before. A determination, a willingness to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And in that moment, Arthur realized that no matter what happened, they would face it together. "Whatever comes next," Arthur said, his voice steady, "we'll handle it, we'll fight for what's ours, and we'll come out stronger on the other side." Michael nodded, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "We will, Dad. We'll figure this out." And with that, father and son stood united, ready to face the storm that was coming. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They were in this together, and nothing would break the bond they were rebuilding. The days that followed John Harper's visit were some of the most challenging Arthur had ever faced. The small chalet in the Swiss Alps, once a place of peace and reflection, now felt like a war room. Documents were strewn across the table. Phone calls with attorneys became a daily ritual, and every conversation with Michael was laced with a tension neither could fully shake. Arthur had reached out to his longtime attorney back in Boston, a man named Robert Grant who had helped him navigate the legalities of Margaret's estate after her death. Robert was a steady presence, offering advice and guidance as Arthur and Michael faced the daunting legal claim from Margaret's brother's estate. "I've reviewed the documents, Arthur," Robert said during one of their calls. "The claim from George's estate is legitimate. It appears that Margaret did borrow a substantial amount of money from her brother to fund those initial investments. The paperwork is solid." Arthur felt a pit form in his stomach. "What does this mean for us, Robert?" "It means that if we don't contest the claim, George's estate could be entitled to as much as 50% of the returns from those investments," Robert explained. "It's a significant portion, Arthur, potentially millions." Arthur gripped the phone tightly. "But if we do contest it?" Robert hesitated. "If we contest it, we could be tied up in legal battles for years. The outcome is uncertain, and the legal fees alone could be astronomical. It's a risk, Arthur. A big one." Arthur sighed, glancing over at Michael, who was sitting across the room, staring out the window with a look of deep concern on his face. "I don't want to lose everything we've worked for, Robert. There has to be another way." "There is another option," Robert said after a moment. "We could try to negotiate a settlement with George's estate. It would mean giving up a portion of the money, but it could save you from a lengthy and costly legal battle. You'd still have enough to secure your future and Michael's, but it wouldn't be the full amount." Arthur leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had thought that this money would be his ticket to freedom, his chance to live out his final years without worry. But now it seemed that even this was slipping through his fingers. "I'll think about it, Robert," Arthur said finally. "Thank you for your help." "Take your time, Arthur," Robert replied. "But don't wait too long. The sooner we make a decision, the better." As Arthur hung up the phone, Michael turned to him, his face pale. "What did he say?" Arthur took a deep breath, then explained everything: the legitimacy of the claim, the risks of contesting it, and the possibility of negotiating a settlement. Michael listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. When Arthur finished, Michael stood up and began pacing the room. "This isn't fair," Michael muttered, his fists clenched. "We shouldn't have to give up anything. That money is ours. Mom wanted us to have it." "I know, Michael," Arthur said softly, "but sometimes life isn't fair. We have to decide what's more important. Fighting for every last penny, or securing what we can and moving forward." Michael stopped pacing and looked at his father, his eyes filled with frustration. "So what are we supposed to do? Just give up?" Arthur shook his head. "No, not give up. But maybe it's time we think about what really matters. The money is important, yes, but it's not everything. We've come a long way, Michael. We've started to rebuild our relationship, and that's worth more than any amount of money." Michael's shoulders slumped, and he sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "I just don't want to lose everything, Dad. I don't want to go back to the way things were." Arthur walked over and sat down beside his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We won't lose everything, Michael. We still have each other, and we still have enough to build a good life. But we have to be smart about this. We have to make the right choice, not just the easy one." Michael looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, fear, and something else. Something that Arthur hadn't seen in a long time: trust. "Okay," Michael said finally. "Let's do it. Let's negotiate." Arthur nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't the outcome he had hoped for, but it was a step toward securing their future together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations. Arthur and Michael worked closely with Robert, who communicated with the attorneys representing George's estate. The process was grueling, filled with back-and-forth offers, counteroffers, and tense discussions. But through it all, Arthur and Michael remained united, determined to protect what they could. As they navigated the legal minefield, Arthur began to notice a change in Michael. His son was becoming more engaged, more focused. The anger and bitterness that had once defined him seemed to be fading, replaced by a newfound determination. Michael began talking about the future, not just in terms of money, but in terms of what he wanted to do with his life. "Dad," Michael said one evening as they sat by the fire, reviewing the latest offer from George's estate, "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding something I'm passionate about." Arthur looked up from the documents, curious. And I think I want to go back to school," Michael continued, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Not just to get a degree, but to really study something I care about. Maybe psychology or counseling. I want to help people who feel lost, like I did." Arthur felt a swell of pride. "That's a wonderful idea, Michael. I think you'd be great at it." Michael smiled, though it was tinged with doubt. "You really think so?" "I know so," Arthur replied firmly. "You've come a long way, Michael. You've learned a lot about yourself, and I think you have a lot to offer others." Michael nodded, the flicker of hope in his eyes growing stronger. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." As they continued to work through the negotiations, Arthur found himself more at peace with the situation. He had started this journey hoping to secure a future for himself, but now he realized that the real reward was seeing his son finally find his way. After weeks of intense negotiations, they finally reached a settlement. George's estate agreed to take a portion of the returns from the investments, but it was less than the 50% they had initially demanded. It was a compromise, but one that allowed Arthur and Michael to retain a significant portion of the fortune. When the final papers were signed, Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had secured their future, and more importantly, they had done it together. The days that followed were filled with plans for the future. Arthur decided to remain in Switzerland for a while longer, enjoying the peace and beauty of the Alps. Michael, with renewed purpose, began looking into universities where he could study psychology. It was a new beginning for both of them, one that they had earned through hard work and perseverance. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of the chalet, watching the sun set over the mountains, Michael turned to his father. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for everything. I know I haven't always made it easy, but I'm glad we've come this far." Arthur smiled, his heart full. "I'm proud of you, Michael. You've grown a lot, and I know you'll do great things." Michael nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "I hope so. I want to make you proud." "You already have," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mountains in a golden glow, Arthur and Michael sat in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they had weathered the storm together. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it side by side, as father and son, as family. But just as they began to settle into this new chapter of their lives, an unexpected visitor arrived at the chalet, bringing with them a revelation that would turn everything upside down once again. The days of peace in the Swiss Alps had become a routine for Arthur and Michael, a much-needed respite after the turmoil of the legal battles. The chalet, with its cozy warmth and breathtaking views, felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could both heal and plan for the future. Michael had begun applying to universities, excited about the prospect of a new beginning, while Arthur reveled in the calm, knowing they had overcome so much together. But one crisp autumn morning, as the first hints of winter began to settle over the mountains, a knock on the door shattered their tranquility. Arthur, who had been enjoying a quiet cup of coffee by the fire, set his mug down and went to answer the door, wondering who could be visiting them in such a remote location. When he opened the door, he found a woman standing there, bundled against the cold. She was in her late 40s, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that held a mix of determination and anxiety. Arthur didn't recognize her, but there was something familiar in the way she looked at him, as if she had been searching for him for a long time. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, that's me," Arthur replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My name is Sarah Whitman. I'm your niece." Arthur blinked, stunned into silence. He had no living relatives that he knew of, especially not a niece. Margaret had no sisters, and as far as he knew, neither of her brothers had children. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this woman could possibly be related to him. "Niece," Arthur echoed, still trying to process the revelation. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. How could you be my niece?" Sarah stepped forward, her expression earnest. "I know this is a shock, and I don't want to overwhelm you, but it's true. My mother was your sister." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "My sister?" he repeated, disbelief coloring his words. "But that's not possible. My sister, Ellen, died when I was a child. She was only a baby." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "That's what you were told. But the truth is more complicated than that. My mother, your sister, was given up for adoption after she was born. Your parents couldn't afford to raise another child, so they made the heartbreaking decision to give her up." Arthur felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His parents had never spoken of another child, never hinted at the possibility that Ellen had lived. He had grown up believing she had died as a baby, and the grief of that loss had always been a silent presence in his life. "How do you know all of this?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pulled a small, weathered envelope from her coat pocket and handed it to Arthur. "My mother left this for me before she passed away. She always knew she had been adopted, but she didn't learn the full story until much later in life. This letter, it explains everything. She wanted me to find you, to tell you the truth." Arthur took the envelope with trembling hands and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, written in elegant script, the ink slightly faded with age. As he began to read, the world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the words on the page and the weight of their meaning. "Arthur," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am no longer in this world, but I hope that my daughter, Sarah, has found you and delivered this letter as I wished. I am Ellen, your sister, though you may not remember me. I was given up for adoption when I was just a baby, and I grew up never knowing the family that gave me life. But I found peace in the knowledge that my parents did what they thought was best for me, and I hold no bitterness toward them or you." The letter went on to describe Ellen's life, her adoption by a kind and loving family, her marriage, and the birth of her own children. She had lived a full and happy life, but there had always been a part of her that longed to know her true origins. When she finally learned the truth, it was too late to reconnect with her birth parents, but she had hoped to find Arthur, the brother she had never known. "I don't want anything from you, Arthur," the letter concluded. "I only wanted you to know that I lived, that I was happy, and that I thought of you often. If my daughter, Sarah, is reading this letter to you, it means she has found you, and I hope you can welcome her as family. She is a good person, and I know she would love to have you in her life." By the time Arthur finished reading, tears were streaming down his face. He had always believed he was alone in the world, that the only family he had left was Michael. But now, in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. He had a sister he had never known, and now, standing before him, was his niece, a living connection to the family he thought he had lost. Arthur looked up at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and trepidation. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Sarah said gently. "I know this is a lot to take in. I wasn't even sure if I should come, but after everything my mother told me, I felt like I had to try. I just wanted to meet you, to see if we could be part of each other's lives." Arthur nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice gaining strength. I'm just sorry that I didn't know sooner." Sarah smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "It's not your fault. My mother always said that things happen when they're meant to. Maybe this is the right time for us to find each other." At that moment, Michael appeared in the doorway, a look of concern on his face. "Dad, is everything okay? Who's at the door?" Arthur turned to his son, a mixture of emotions swirling within him. "Michael, this is Sarah. She's your cousin." Michael's eyes widened in shock. "My cousin? But I thought we didn't have any family." Arthur took a deep breath and briefly explained everything Sarah had told him. The truth about Ellen, her adoption, and the letter she had left behind. Michael listened in stunned silence, trying to absorb the revelation. "So we're not alone," Michael said finally, his voice filled with wonder. "We have family." Arthur nodded, a sense of warmth and belonging beginning to replace the shock and confusion. "Yes, we do." Michael stepped forward and extended a hand to Sarah, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Michael." Sarah took his hand, her own smile brightening her features. "It's nice to meet you too, Michael. I'm just glad I finally found you both." They invited Sarah inside, and the three of them spent the next several hours talking, sharing stories, and learning about each other's lives. Sarah told them about her childhood, her career as a teacher, and the close relationship she had shared with her mother. Arthur and Michael, in turn, shared their own stories, their struggles, their journey to Switzerland, and the bond they had been working so hard to rebuild. As the afternoon turned into evening, Arthur found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Sarah's arrival had been unexpected, but it had brought with it the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to reconnect with a part of his life he had thought was lost forever. But as they sat together, laughing and talking, another thought began to creep into Arthur's mind, a thought that made him uneasy. Sarah seemed genuine, and the letter from Ellen had touched his heart. But there was a part of him that couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this story. He had spent so many years guarding himself against disappointment and betrayal, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to let his guard down completely. Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed in the guest room they had hastily prepared, Arthur sat by the fire, deep in thought. Michael joined him, a cup of tea in hand, and they sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own reflections. "What do you think, Dad?" Michael asked finally, breaking the silence. "Do you believe her?" Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "I want to believe her, Michael. She seems sincere, and the letter from Ellen. It feels real, but part of me is still cautious. We've been through so much, and I just don't want to be hurt again." Michael nodded, understanding the conflict in his father's heart. "I get it, but maybe this is the good thing we've been waiting for. Maybe it's time to let someone else in." Arthur looked at his son, seeing the hope in his eyes, and felt his own heart soften. "You're right, Michael. We've spent so much time fighting battles, dealing with loss. Maybe it's time to focus on building something new." Michael smiled, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Then let's give her a chance, Dad. Let's see where this goes." Arthur nodded, a sense of resolution settling over him. "Okay, we'll give her a chance." But even as he spoke the words, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. A doubt that would soon prove prophetic, as the truth behind Sarah's arrival began to unravel, leading Arthur and Michael into a new conflict that would test their bond once more. The next few days in the chalet were filled with a mix of cautious optimism and underlying tension. Arthur, Michael, and Sarah spent time together exploring the surrounding countryside, sharing meals, and learning more about each other's lives. It felt like a new beginning, a chance for Arthur to reconnect with a family he never knew he had, and for Michael to experience the warmth of extended family for the first time in his life. But beneath the surface, doubts lingered in Arthur's mind. As much as he wanted to embrace this new connection, something about Sarah's sudden appearance and her story didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than she had revealed. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Arthur decided to bring up his concerns. Michael and Sarah were talking animatedly about some hiking trails they wanted to explore, but Arthur's thoughts were elsewhere. "Sarah," Arthur began, his tone cautious but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told us, about your mother and how you found us." Sarah turned to him, her expression open and curious. Yes, Uncle Arthur? Arthur hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't mean to sound ungrateful or suspicious, but there are some things I'm struggling to understand. You said your mother was given up for adoption, but she never knew who her biological family was until much later in life. How exactly did she find out about us? Sarah's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. It's a complicated story, she said softly. My mother always knew she was adopted, but she didn't know the full details until she was much older. After her adoptive parents passed away, she started looking into her background, trying to trace her biological family. It took years, but eventually, she found out about you. How did she find out? Arthur pressed gently. Were there records? Did someone contact her? Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She found some old records, papers that had been hidden away for years. They mentioned your name and the circumstances of her adoption. It was a shock for her, but she was determined to find you. Arthur nodded, but his mind was still racing. And she never tried to contact me? Never reached out? Sarah shook her head. By the time she found out, it was too late. She was already ill, and she didn't have the strength to go looking for you herself. That's why she left me the letter, why she asked me to find you after she was gone. The explanation made sense on the surface, but something still didn't add up for Arthur. He had lived his whole life believing his sister had died as a baby. How could there have been records that mentioned him? Records he had never known about? Michael, sensing his father's unease, spoke up. Dad, maybe we could look into this more just to be sure. I mean, there's nothing wrong with getting some clarity, right? Arthur glanced at his son, seeing the concern in his eyes. He knew Michael was trying to be supportive, but Arthur also knew that Michael shared his doubts, even if he didn't want to admit it. I think that's a good idea, Arthur said finally, turning back to Sarah. We're not questioning your story, Sarah. We just want to make sure we understand everything fully. Sarah nodded, her smile returning, though it seemed a bit forced. Of course, I understand. I can help you find whatever you need. With that, the conversation shifted to other topics, but the unease lingered. After Sarah retired to bed that night, Arthur and Michael stayed up, discussing their next steps. I want to believe her, Dad, Michael said quietly as they sat by the dying fire. But I can tell you're worried, and I don't blame you. Something about this just feels off. Arthur sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I don't want to doubt her, Michael, but we've been through so much already, and I can't help but feel like we're missing something. I think we need to dig a little deeper. Michael nodded. I'll help you, Dad. We'll figure this out together. The next morning, while Sarah was out on a walk, Arthur and Michael began their investigation. They started by reaching out to Robert Grant, Arthur's attorney, to see if he could access any records about Ellen's adoption. They also contacted a private investigator in the U.S. who specialized in tracing family histories, hoping to uncover more details about Sarah's story. Days passed as they waited for information to come in, and during that time, Arthur and Michael continued to interact with Sarah as if nothing had changed. But the tension between them grew, fueled by the uncertainty of what they might discover. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first piece of information arrived. Robert called with an update, his voice serious. Arthur, I've managed to track down some records related to your sister's adoption, Robert said. It turns out there was a significant amount of secrecy surrounding the case. Your parents were in financial trouble at the time, and they arranged the adoption through a private agency that specialized in discreet placements. Arthur felt a pang of sadness as he listened. He had known his family had struggled financially, but he had never imagined they would have given up a child because of it. What else did you find, Robert? Arthur asked, bracing himself. Well, here's where it gets complicated, Robert continued. It seems that after Ellen was placed with her adoptive family, the records were sealed, and there was no further contact between them and your parents. However, the adoption agency went out of business a few years later, and most of the records were lost or destroyed. Arthur's heart sank. So there's no way to confirm any of this? Not through official records, no, Robert admitted. But I did find something else. The adoption agency was known to have some irregularities in their practices. There were rumors that they sometimes fabricated or altered documents to cover their tracks. Arthur's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you saying there's a possibility that Ellen wasn't actually my sister?" "It's possible," Robert said cautiously. "Without solid records, we can't be sure of anything. But it raises questions about the validity of Sarah's claims." Arthur's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. If the adoption records were unreliable, then everything Sarah had told them could be based on a lie that she might not even be aware of. "Thank you, Robert," Arthur said, his voice heavy. "I appreciate your help." After hanging up, Arthur shared the news with Michael, who reacted with a mixture of anger and confusion. "So what does this mean?" Michael asked, pacing the room. "Is she our cousin or not? And if she isn't, then who is she?" "I don't know, Michael," Arthur replied, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. "But we need to find out." Their next step was to wait for the private investigator's report, which arrived a few days later. When Arthur opened the email, his hands shook with anticipation. The report confirmed some of what they already knew. Ellen had been adopted by a family in the Midwest, where she had lived a relatively quiet life. But there was something else. Something that sent a chill down Arthur's spine. The investigator had traced Sarah's background as well, and while her mother's name matched Ellen's, there were discrepancies in other details. Sarah had a history that didn't align with the story she had told. There were records of her being involved in legal disputes over inheritance claims, and several instances where she had attempted to connect with distant relatives under dubious circumstances. Arthur felt sick to his stomach as he read the report. Sarah had a pattern of seeking out potential family members with the aim of claiming a share of their wealth. It was clear that she had targeted Arthur and Michael, hoping to exploit the emotional connection to secure a place in their lives and their inheritance. Michael, reading over his father's shoulder, reacted with fury. "She lied to us. She's just after the money, Dad. We need to confront her. Kick her out." Arthur, though devastated by the betrayal, felt a wave of sadness more than anger. He had let his guard down, allowed himself to hope that he could find a new connection, a new family. But now it was clear that Sarah had manipulated them, playing on their vulnerability for her own gain. "We need to be careful, Michael," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "If we confront her too aggressively, she might lash out. We need to think this through." Michael's eyes blazed with anger, but he nodded, understanding the wisdom in his father's words. "So what do we do?" "We need to get her to leave on her own," Arthur replied, thinking quickly. "We'll confront her, but we'll do it in a way that makes it clear we know the truth. If she realizes she's been caught, she might decide it's not worth the fight and leave quietly." The plan was set, and that evening, as they sat down for dinner, Arthur and Michael prepared themselves for the difficult conversation ahead. Sarah seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting away about a new hike she wanted to try the next day. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Arthur decided it was time. "Sarah," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Sarah looked up, her smile fading slightly as she sensed the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, Uncle Arthur?" Arthur took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "We've been looking into some things, your mother's adoption, your background. We found some inconsistencies in your story." Sarah's face paled, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely shocked. "What do you mean? What inconsistencies?" "We know about your history, Sarah," Michael cut in, unable to contain his anger. "The legal disputes, the inheritance claims. You've done this before, tried to claim you were part of someone's family to get money." Sarah's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, that's not true. I'm not lying. I really am your niece, Uncle Arthur. My mother was Ellen, your sister." "Maybe she was," Arthur said quietly, his eyes filled with sorrow. "But maybe she wasn't. The adoption records are unclear, and your own history raises too many questions. We want to believe you, Sarah, but we can't ignore the facts." Sarah's face crumpled, and for a moment, Arthur thought she might break down. But then her expression hardened, and she stood up, her eyes flashing with defiance. So you're throwing me out? She demanded, her voice shaking. After everything I've told you, everything I've done to find you? We're asking you to leave, Arthur said softly, but with finality. We need time to sort this out, to understand the truth. If you're really family, then you'll understand why we need to do this. Sarah stared at them both, her eyes narrowing as if calculating her next move. For a moment, Arthur thought she might lash out, but then she took a deep breath and forced a smile. Fine, she said coldly. I'll leave, but you're making a mistake. You'll realize that when it's too late. With that, she turned and marched out of the room, leaving Arthur and Michael in stunned silence. The next morning, Sarah was gone. She had left the chalet early, taking her belongings with her, and leaving behind only a terse note that simply read, "Goodbye." As Arthur read the note, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He had hoped for a new connection, a new chapter in his life, but instead, he was left with more questions than answers. Michael joined him in the kitchen, where Arthur stood holding the note. "She's gone," Michael said, his voice flat. Arthur nodded, setting the note down. "Yes, she's gone." They stood there in silence for a moment, both grappling with the weight of what had happened. Finally, Michael spoke. "Do you think she was really our family, Dad?" Arthur sighed, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know, Michael, but I think we did the right thing. We couldn't let her stay without knowing the truth." Michael nodded, but the sadness in his eyes mirrored his father's. "I just wish it hadn't turned out this way." "Me too, son," Arthur said softly. "Me too." But even as they tried to move on from the ordeal, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends, and he knew that until they found the truth, the shadow of Sarah's visit would continue to hang over them. Days turned into weeks, and the cold grip of winter began to settle over the Swiss Alps. Arthur and Michael remained in the chalet, the weight of Sarah's visit hanging over them like a cloud. Although she had left without further confrontation, her departure had left them both with a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that something crucial had been left unresolved. Arthur couldn't let it go. He spent hours each day by the fire, sifting through the information they had gathered, trying to make sense of the tangled web that Sarah had woven around them. The mystery of his sister's adoption, the inconsistencies in Sarah's story, and the lingering doubt about whether she was truly family gnawed at him. Michael tried to focus on his plans for the future, on the universities he wanted to apply to and the new life he was beginning to envision for himself. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they had missed, some crucial piece of the puzzle that had yet to be uncovered. It wasn't until a cold, snowy morning in mid-December that the final piece of the mystery arrived. Arthur had just settled down with a cup of coffee when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence of the chalet. He answered it, his heart pounding as he recognized the voice on the other end. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Robert Grant," his attorney said, his voice urgent. "I found something important. You need to hear this." Arthur gripped the phone tightly. "What is it, Robert? What did you find?" "I've been digging deeper into the adoption records, trying to verify Sarah's story," Robert explained, "and I came across something that changes everything. It turns out that there were 2 babies involved in the adoption. Your sister Ellen and another baby, a boy, who was also placed for adoption around the same time." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "A boy? But how could that be? My parents never mentioned another child." "That's the thing, Arthur," Robert continued. "The records indicate that your parents only knew about one child being placed for adoption. But the agency, remember, it was known for its irregular practices, apparently split the children up. Ellen went to one family, and the boy went to another." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. "And what happened to the boy?" "That's where it gets complicated," Robert said, his tone grave. "The boy's records were lost when the agency shut down, but there were some notes in the archives that suggest he might have been placed with a different family entirely, one that was connected to the agency's director. It's all very murky, but it seems like there's a possibility that the boy grew up without ever knowing his true origins." Arthur's mind reeled as he tried to process this new information. A brother? Another sibling he had never known about? The implications were staggering, and they only deepened the mystery surrounding Sarah's arrival. "Robert, do you think Sarah knows about this?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure," Robert replied. "But given her history and the information we've uncovered, it's possible that she was aware of it, or at least suspected something. She might have been trying to find out more about her own origins and thought that connecting with you would help her." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they still didn't form a complete picture. If Sarah had known about this other child, this boy who might have been his brother, then what did that mean for everything she had told them? "Thank you, Robert," Arthur said finally, his voice heavy. "I'll need some time to think about all of this." "Of course, Arthur," Robert replied. "But if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." After hanging up the phone, Arthur sat in silence, his thoughts racing. The revelation about the other child, the boy who might have been his brother, had shaken him to his core. And as much as he wanted to believe that this discovery would bring them closer to the truth, it only seemed to deepen the mystery. When Michael returned to the chalet later that afternoon, Arthur shared the news with him. Michael listened in stunned silence, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "A brother," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how could that be?" "I don't know," Arthur admitted, feeling the weight of his uncertainty. "But if it's true, it changes everything. And it might explain why Sarah came to us in the first place." Michael frowned, trying to piece it together. "Do you think she was looking for him? For our brother?" "Maybe," Arthur said slowly. "Or maybe she was trying to find out more about her own past, and thought that connecting with us would give her the answers she needed." They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them grappling with the implications of this new information. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice filled with determination. "Dad, we need to find out the truth. We can't just leave this hanging. We need to know what really happened." Arthur nodded, feeling the same resolve. "You're right, Michael. We need to know the truth." With renewed purpose, they began to dig deeper into the mystery. Arthur reached out to Robert again, asking him to continue searching for any records related to the other child. Michael, meanwhile, began looking into Sarah's background more thoroughly, trying to trace her movements and connections. Days turned into weeks, and the snow outside the chalet grew deeper, covering the landscape in a blanket of white. The cold, stark beauty of the mountains seemed to mirror the growing intensity of their search, as they delved deeper into the past, hoping to uncover the truth. Finally, just as the new year dawned, they received a breakthrough. Robert had managed to track down a former employee of the adoption agency, a woman who had been in charge of filing records in the final years before the agency shut down. She had been reluctant to talk at first, but after some persuasion, she agreed to meet with Arthur and Michael in person. The woman's name was Martha Reynolds, and she was now in her late 70s, living in a small town in southern Germany. Arthur and Michael made the journey to meet her, their hearts filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. When they arrived at Martha's modest home, she greeted them with a wary smile. Her eyes were sharp, despite her age, and there was a hint of sadness in her expression that spoke of long-buried secrets. "Thank you for meeting with us, Mrs. Reynolds," Arthur said as they sat down in her cozy living room. "We appreciate your willingness to help us." Martha nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she poured them tea. "I wasn't sure if I should agree to this," she admitted. "The past is complicated. But when I heard what you were looking for, I knew I couldn't stay silent." Arthur and Michael exchanged a glance, both of them on edge. "What can you tell us about the adoption agency?" Arthur asked gently. "And about the two children, my sister Ellen and the boy who was adopted around the same time?" Martha sighed, setting down her teacup. "The agency was a mess," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "It was supposed to be a place where families could find homes for their children, but it wasn't always that simple. There were a lot of deals made under the table, records that were altered or destroyed. And the director, well, let's just say he wasn't always on the right side of the law. Arthur's heart sank. What about the boy? Martha hesitated, then took a deep breath. The boy was special, she said quietly. His adoption was handled personally by the director. He was placed with a wealthy family who had ties to the agency, people who wanted to keep the whole thing very quiet. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I remember the director saying that the boy would never know the truth about his origins. Arthur's chest tightened as he listened. Do you know the name of the family? Anything that could help us find him? Martha shook her head. I'm sorry, I don't. The records were sealed, and most of them were lost when the agency shut down. But I do remember one thing. The director was very insistent that the boy never be told about his real family. He wanted to make sure that no one would ever connect him to the agency. Michael, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. Do you think Sarah knew about this? Could she have been looking for him? It's possible, Martha said thoughtfully. If she knew about the boy, she might have thought that finding you would lead her to him. But without the records, it's hard to say for sure. Arthur felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over him. They had come so close, only to be met with more questions, more uncertainty. But even as the truth seemed to slip further away, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the right track, that they were getting closer to the answers they sought. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. You've given us more than you know. Martha smiled sadly. I wish I could have done more, but I hope you find what you're looking for. As they left Martha's home and made their way back to the chalet, Arthur and Michael were silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The revelations they had uncovered were overwhelming, and the weight of the mystery pressed heavily on them both. When they returned to the chalet, Arthur sat down by the fire, staring into the flames as he tried to make sense of everything. Michael joined him, his expression troubled. Dad, what do we do now? Michael asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. We've found out so much, but it feels like we're still missing something. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know, Michael, but I think we need to keep searching, keep trying to find the truth. We've come this far, we can't give up now. Michael nodded, but there was a weariness in his eyes that Arthur hadn't seen before. I just want to know, Dad. I want to know if we really have a brother out there, if Sarah was telling the truth about anything. We'll find out, Arthur said, though his own resolve was beginning to waver. We'll keep looking until we do. But as the days passed, and the winter deepened, their search seemed to hit a wall. The records were too old, too fragmented, and every lead they followed seemed to end in more questions. Arthur began to wonder if they would ever find the truth, or if the mystery of his family would remain unsolved forever. Then, one morning in late January, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. He was sitting by the fire, lost in thought, when there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found a young man standing there, shivering in the cold. Mr. Sullivan? The young man asked, his voice trembling. Yes, I'm Arthur Sullivan, Arthur replied, puzzled. Who are you? The young man hesitated, then took a deep breath. My name is David. I think I might be your brother. Arthur's heart stopped. What did you say? David reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. I found this among my adoptive parents' things after they passed away. It's a letter from the adoption agency, and it mentions your name. I've been trying to find you for months. Arthur took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. The letter inside was old, the paper yellowed with age, but the words were clear. It was a letter from the adoption agency, addressed to David's adoptive parents, informing them of the boy's adoption and instructing them to keep his origins a secret. Arthur's name was mentioned as the boy's biological brother. Arthur felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked up at David. You're really him. You're my brother. David nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. I didn't know. I grew up never knowing where I came from, who my real family was. But when I found the letter, I knew I had to find you. Arthur reached out and pulled David into a tight embrace, feeling a flood of emotions. Relief, joy, and a deep sense of connection that he had never thought he would find. "Welcome home, David," Arthur whispered, his voice choked with emotion. As they stood there, holding each other, Michael appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad? Is this?" Arthur nodded, smiling through his tears. "Michael, this is David. Your uncle." Michael stepped forward, his face a mix of shock and happiness. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice trembling. "We really found you." David smiled, wiping away his tears. "I'm just glad I found you both. I've spent my whole life wondering who I was. And now I finally know." The three of them stood there in the doorway, the snow falling softly around them, as the weight of the past melted away. They had found each other, against all odds, and in that moment, the mystery that had haunted them was finally laid to rest. In the days that followed, Arthur, Michael, and David spent hours talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, as they filled in the gaps of their shared history and built a future together. And as they sat by the fire in the chalet, the warmth of family surrounding them, Arthur felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent his life searching for connection, for meaning, and now, in his final years, he had found it in the most unexpected way. The mystery of his past had led him to the greatest discovery of all, the discovery of family. And as he looked at his brother and his son, Arthur knew that he was no longer alone. For the first time in a long time, Arthur Sullivan felt truly at home.